So, hello everybody. It's really nice to be here. Very happy to be, having such great students. Already I've had a lot of good conversations. You know who you are. So the topic today is the hierarchy of FrameNet. Miriam's already talked about the basis of that hierarchy, the kinds of relations that we have. And so now we're just going to go on a little tour to see what's there in the broad outlines. So first, there's going to be a little distraction, as Miriam advertised. There's going to be semantic types, which are exactly those things that don't fit into the hierarchy. The whole reason why we have semantic types is because not all information is neatly categorizable into subtyping or any of these other kinds. Sometimes these pieces of information cross-cut all of the other distinctions that we want to make. And then we'll go through the high points of the hierarchy, high-level frames, and large frame families. First of all, as Miriam already indicated, so I'm going to go through relatively quickly, there are two really basic kinds of semantic types. One of them is a real semantic type. So they just simply indicate types as you'd expect, and they're placed both on frame elements to indicate what kinds of things you expect to actually occur in that frame element. And they're used on frames and lexical units to indicate that they are that kind of thing. In other words, that they might occur in that kind of frame element position. And the other kind of type is not a type at all. It is really best understood as sort of shorthand instructions on how to use frames and lexical units. Because actually, for reasons of either expediency, just because it makes it easier, or for reasons of limitations of our data structure, we have introduced some additional semantic types to say, actually, you have to do something special here if you want to use our data properly. Okay, so just to exemplify a few of the basic types. So many of them come from WordNet. And if you don't know what WordNet is, don't worry about that too much. If you do know what WordNet is, then this is useful to you. So WordNet is a separate lexical resource that has a hierarchy of its own. But overall, this hierarchy is less complex than FrameNet. Just out of curiosity, can you raise your hand if you have heard of WordNet? Okay, that's most people, but not everyone, definitely. Yeah, so there will be more discussion of this in several different places in the lectures in the coming week. But one thing that WordNet has is, towards the top of its hierarchy, it has things like time, location, entity, event. These are very basic categories of things, which we found useful as well. But then there are some kinds of things that were very useful to us that they didn't have frame elements for. So things like, because we have a manner frame element, we needed a manner semantic type, but they don't have one in WordNet. So we added them. This kind of semantic type is potentially quite useful for computational processing. So both for automatic role labeling, which we will talk about more later, and also for something I'm working on now with metaphor identification, and also for inferencing. this is the part of FrameNet that is very much like an ontology. Also, as I mentioned, some semantic types are abbreviated instructions. They're definitely not types in the usual sense. So really you can think of our labeling them semantic types. It's really just a label that means this is how we put them in the database. It's not meant to be a deep understanding of what these guys are. And there's two basic divisions. They can occur on frames or on lexical units. So the ones that you can call framal metatypes, because metatypes is actually a better description for what these guys are. There's two, only two, so these should be easy to understand, and Miriam already mentioned one of them. So one of them is non-lexical frame. So this is just a way of saying in a very brief way, we don't even intend to put words in this frame. So, well, why do we do that? I mean, basically we're mostly, the project is supposed to be annotating sentences, and those sentences come from words, real words, that are attached to real frames. Well, we also want to be able to do inferencing. We also want to be able to show the relationships between different frames that we have. And sometimes to do that, you have to invent a frame that doesn't have any vocabulary directly associated with it. So one example is a crime scenario. Or, as Miriam and Thiago were discussing earlier, you guys are intending to make a tourism macro frame. And this, in that case, it may have vocabulary directly pertaining to it. But in many cases, there is no vocabulary that exactly picks out that idea. But it is assumed as a background for all the other vocabulary that is in that domain. The other kind of framal metatype there is a non-perspectivized frame. So what this means is that the relationship of the words that are in the frame is variable. So if I translate it to Latin, you pronounce that caveat emptor. So buyer beware. That means in most cases, all of the semantics of a frame, all of the lexical units that are in a frame, they all have the same relationship to the frame. Normally they're all. So if the frame is giving, then everything which is in the frame represents the action of giving. If the frame is natural features, then the frame contains all kinds of natural features like mountains and streams and all that stuff. It's not going to contain some verb about swimming. But if there was the marker non-perspectivized frame on natural features, you shouldn't be surprised to find sailing in there. That means that there's a lot of potentially a very large amount of variability in the frame. Another translation of non-perspectivized is we got too lazy to make an entire family of frames. Also known as our funders were not interested in all of the frames that we would have to do, for example, in the case of performers and roles. So we wanted to be able to say something about the relationship of actors and other people that are involved in movies and movies. But there's a lot of vocabulary there, a huge amount, and all the different vocabulary, like to star in a film or to co-star in a film. Well, I mean, those are similar, but co-star has an extra frame element. Appear in a film is also in this frame, but it doesn't have the same meaning, actually, as to star in the film. Role, the noun, actor, the noun, and many, many other ideas that you could put in here. You could, since it's non-perspectivized, you could also find the verb to direct, as in he directed Grosse Point Blank. So that tells you that there's a lot of variability. Just to connect this back to things we've previously talked about, we could have taken everything from the commerce family of frames, put them all in one frame, and marked it this way. But as I say, in a way, this is shorthand for a more elaborated analysis. And because of that, we actually prefer, when it's possible, when we have the time, to expand that out and give the exact relationships between all of the pieces.
You may choose to answer that next week,
Mm-hmm.
okay? But sometimes I feel that some non-lexical frame would be evoked by constructions, not by words.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that definitely happens. And I will probably take that on next week rather than talk about it here. That's basically what I will say here is that in general, the addition of non-lexical constructions to FrameNet involves some rethinking of the way we do things. This is one of those cases. Okay. So we also have lexical metatypes. Ooh, that was fun. We okay? Yeah. Okay. We have lexical metatypes, and there definitely are more of those to go into than I'm going to spend time on here. So I'm just going to give you a high-level view. They are described in more detail in the book chapter that was assigned. So the basic high-level kinds are listed here. One of them is biframal lexical unit. What that says in general is that actually the lexical unit you are looking at that is marked with this semantic type does not belong to the frame in the normal way. It actually evokes another frame that we don't even have in the hierarchy. So for example, there's a semantic type habilitative passive, which may be the worst name in FrameNet. I'm not sure. I mean, I can say that because I came up with this one. But the idea is that there's many, many, many words that end in the suffix able, and some other words that mean the same thing, like fragile, that don't end in the suffix, but they have the same semantic relationship. And in all those cases, we don't really want to make a separate adjective frame. We could, and we would know exactly how to define it, but it would probably only have one word in it. And it's a lot of work to produce a frame that has perhaps only one word. And that word might be very low frequency. So discussable is absolutely a word of English, but it's not a frequent one. And I probably don't want to have another frame right next to the discussion frame that has all of the adjectives of this kind in there. So what it basically means for a word like mobile, which is we put in the bringing frame, what that means is that this word actually evokes an ability frame. It's a subtype of the ability frame that, in effect, uses the frame that it's in, the bringing frame. Okay? Does that make some kind of sense? This is probably, if you really need to know this, you may have to read the chapter because it's actually not easy to explain just sitting here. But I will try, if anybody has a question now, to answer. So is this something anybody has a question about? Not at the moment. Okay, Miriam does.
I don't have a question, but I thought it might be useful to say that FrameNet knows that this is not the whole story, right? It's a shortcut. Think of it as the placeholder for more work to come, right? We don't attribute a lot of theoretical importance to this fix.
Just to add to that, in the part, in the lecture where I'm talking about how to use FrameNet for doing natural language processing, especially the inferencing part, I will talk about how you effectively unpack this to make what you can call virtual frames. So these are really instructions in that they're precise enough that you can take these instructions and produce the frame that we didn't bother to make. So yes, it's a shorthand, and yes, it does mean that there's more work for somebody else to do this unpacking, but it saved us a lot of time to do it this way, and we also tell you in detail how to do that, so it should be okay. All right, the other types are a little bit more straightforward to explain, I think. Transparent nouns is a label that we do words like number in the aggregate frame. So an example of that would be a number of my colleagues want to resign. So this is not number in the sense of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This just means several. So it really is just talking about a quantity and indicating that there's a group that has a particular quantity. So in this case, the reason why we label it as a transparent noun is because if you are doing semantic processing, you shouldn't think that the head of a number of my colleagues in terms of deep semantics is number. You want the real semantic head to be colleagues. And so as a result of that, we want to tell people that they need to do that. Then we have contextually bound lexical units. This particular type is really important, and we probably haven't put it everywhere we should. So we use this when there's a word that evokes the frame. It absolutely means the right thing, but it can only mean that with the right context. So either it has to have a particular word that governs it syntactically, or it must itself govern a particular word syntactically. So one example is put in the causation frame. So, I mean, if you just look at that out of context, you go, what the heck? Well, what does put have to do with causation? But with the right context, it works. So things like, it put me in a bad mood. So that's really meaning that it caused me to be in a bad mood. So the causal part of the semantics comes from put. It absolutely does, right? So I can non-causally say I was in a bad mood, and then if I change be to put, then now it's causal. But it's only in that type of context. Okay? Just to give the other kind, so the other semantic type is called bound-dependent LU, and it's basically the mirror image. So in some cases, we have a word like dirt. which in the right context can mean very. So you might wonder, well, what the heck? Like, how does dirt ever mean very? Well, it's in cases like dirt poor. So in English, that means really, really poor, absolutely poor. And so in a case like that, we put dirt in the degree frame. It makes sense. This is the part of the sentence that tells you what degree of poor somebody is, but you wouldn't want to think that you can use that everywhere, right? You can only use it in a very small number of cases. This helps us out a lot because this means we don't have to make amazingly special frames. And in fact, even if we made amazingly specialized frames, that would still be wrong, because in most of these cases, it's actually not semantically triggered, right? It's not the semantics of the phrase that lets you know that this thing can be used to mean very. It's actually the word poor. So I can't even use a synonym of poor in order to, and then put dirt with it and have it work, okay? So in other words, this is a way to handle partially productive idioms, okay? So we'll talk more about that, especially if you guys tell me that you want to talk more about that. The other two types are affective types. So Miriam mentioned that we have negative and positive judgment. It does exist in frames like judgment, which of course, judgment, it's in general, it's going to be positive or negative. You approve, you disapprove. You like it, you hate it. But it also exists in frames which have nothing to do with judgment by themselves. So, for example, frugality, by itself, all it is about is not spending money. So it's when, do you spend a lot of money? Do you spend a small amount of money? Which by itself, it can be good, it could be bad. So if I spend a lot of money and it's good, then I would label that generous. So the word generous in the frugality frame would have a positive judgment. But if I want to say that somebody is a jerk and I don't like them, then I can say that they are profligate, or that they spend too much money, right? I mean, I can say it many different ways, but this is a way, just in a very neat package, to say both they spend a lot of money, and I think that means that they're bad in some way, or at least unwise. Then we have a few types which are related to specifying a frame element. So in this last category, a very simple example is the visual modality semantic type, which you should put on any verb which is about visual perception. And there it doesn't matter whether it's about the action of perception, the passive perception, whether it's a noun like view, which doesn't have any experiencer or agent or anything in it. Nevertheless, the word view clearly requires vision. So you can put the semantic type on there. Okay. Now we're going to start our little tour. On this slide, I've given you a bunch of the high-level frames of FrameNet. What do I mean when I say high-level? I mean, if you look at the inheritance hierarchy, just the inheritance relation, and you keep going up, just keep tunneling upward, eventually you're probably going to hit one of these. So event is obvious. Probably the majority of frames in FrameNet are describing events. Not all of them, but most. And even within that, most of the events are some kind of intentional act. So we have a subtype of that, intentionally act, which introduces the frame elements of agent and purpose, which we've already talked about a good bit. And then, even more specific than that, most of the frames that inherit from intentionally act are intentionally affect. So that introduces the frame element of patient. Then, almost everything which is an adjective in FrameNet, not all cases, but the normal center of category, center of prototype adjective, is going to inherit from gradable attributes. So this gives you frame elements like degree, it gives you frame elements like some entity which is being graded on a scale, right? So all of these things are introduced at that level, and you need them for adjectives all the way from an adjective like rich to an adjective like interesting to an adjective like red. So you need it for all of those. Then we have entities, and almost all of the nouns that are not in event frames, almost all of those will inherit from entity. And within that, there's a very salient subtype of locale, which describes places. Furthermore, there's a type that we need to do a lot more work on, but which is amazingly important, which is the relation set of frames. So, for example, if you have a preposition, the place that it will normally inherit from is going to be relation. Okay? So let's move on to the event hierarchy. And here you can see that I have a picture from the frame grapher just with the inheritance and precedes relation. And here you can see that event is connected up with a bunch of things. I actually cut off the part where event was connected to a lot of frames. Is this, by the way, is this readable? The red lines are inheritance. I should have said that. The black lines that go side to side are precedes relation and are more or less irrelevant for our purposes right now, except to point out that because all of these frames inherit from event, they also have a temporal structure. Because event has a temporal structure. There's some state which is there before, and there's some different state which is there afterwards. And that's true, I mean, that's definitional for event, and that's true for almost any verb, that the world will be different before and after. So I will be happy to discuss this in more detail, but I think most of these frames are relatively explanatory if you look them up. Just to point out that motion in our hierarchy really has a lot under it. I mean, you see, even in this diagram, you see that there are 29 children that come directly from motion, but there are also a lot of them that are further down below self-motion than this diagram could go. I mean, there's only so much I can put in one diagram. You can also see in this diagram that there are 54 frames that inherit from intentionally act. This makes good sense because, as I said, most of the time when we're talking about what people do, and that's reflected in our frame hierarchy. Okay? Before I move on, do we have any questions about this? Here I have part of the hierarchy for locale. The trouble with locale is that there are many frames that inherit directly from it, so it doesn't make a pretty diagram. So it makes a very wide diagram, which is why I'm going to give the rest of it in the next slide. But here you can see that there are a lot of different ways of talking about places. So you can either talk about places by what kinds of stuff grow there. So forest, that's called biological area. So forest, swamp, plains, sorry, not plains, grassland. And then you have to consider locale by ownership. Then you can consider locale by how it is shaped, and that's natural features. So mountains, plains, and the difference between sea and land. So we also have peninsula, island, all of these things in there. Then we have relational location. So relational location is things like front. And this is actually more important in Spanish, certainly, but I also imagine in Portuguese, because you guys have a smaller number of basic prepositions and a larger number and more frequent use of nouns that actually say something about a location. So front, for example, if I say in front of the school, then front picks out a location which is relative to, which has a relation to the school. I can say in the vicinity of the school. This picks out a different location that has a different relation to the school, okay? Then we actually have, inheriting from both natural features and relational location, we have relational natural features. So this is for things like coast. So a word like coast is relational, right? I mean, it has to be the coast of something, right? So the coast of South America. And interestingly, the other relationship from the point of view, just to get back to perspective slightly, from the point of view of the ocean is called shore. So the shores of the Atlantic, right? Then we have assigned location, which doesn't seem much like the other ones, but it's things like post. So if I'm a military person, then I am told to be someplace, and in fact, terrible things can happen to me if I'm not there. So that's my post. And then you have a locale by characteristic entity, which is things, wow, I actually seem to not remember what that one is. Sorry. And two more frames to worry about. We have locale by use, which characterizes places by how they're used. Obviously, people care about that. One subtype is prison, a very specific kind of use of land. And another subtype is roadways, which we have to distinguish because they actually have extra frame elements, which I'm not going to go into. Okay. Yep. So then moving on, here we have the entity hierarchy. And in this hierarchy, you can see some very, very basic kinds of things. Entities can either be characterized by use, similar to locales, and those things are called artifacts. They can be characterized by biology, similar to locales as well, and then that's biological entities, so species of animals, species of plants, things like that. And people are, of course, a subtype of that. Then you have a more general characterization of things as physical entities, and there's really quite a variety of stuff that's under there. But basically anything which is a physical entity is under there. You can also see that both artifact and people have a lot of frames underneath them, which makes sense. Now I'm going to talk about a few of the frame families for just a few minutes before we finish up. And we've already talked about one of these because Miriam showed the employment family of frames. And one thing that's different about these in terms of how the most useful way to look at them, it's not most useful to look at them just in terms of inheritance. For the examples I was giving before, I was talking in terms of, what inherits from what. So in that case, all you needed were those red lines that told you what is a subtype of what. But for these frame families, it is not the case that hiring is a subtype of firing. And it's not the case, there's any kind of subtyping relationship between them. All the important information is sequencing and perspective and subframes, things of that nature. And inheritance will give the relationship of pieces of that scene to other scenes, right? So in the employment scenario, you see that all of those things came together. Another scene that we've talked about a lot is commerce. And here we have a little piece of the commerce family. And you see that this is messier, so to speak, than the inheritance hierarchies because I've included more relations. I tried to keep it as bounded as possible, but here you can at least see that there's an overall frame commercial transaction, which is highlighted. And there's two subframes, that's what the blue dotted lines are, a commerce goods transfer and a commerce money transfer. So there's two stages which might be simultaneous, or one might happen first and then the other, but there's still two subparts of the frame. And within each of those stages, there are two possible perspectives that we have described in FrameNet so far, although there are other perspectives that we could describe that we haven't. So the most salient of these perspectives are the perspective of the seller and the perspective of the buyer. So we have all of that. You can see here that in both cases of commerce goods transfer and commerce money transfer, that they inherit from transfer. That makes good sense. I mean, in both cases, somebody is transferring something to somebody else. It just happens to be that the directions are opposite. And in fact, if I had the frame grapher here to show you, I could also show that the frame elements are connected, and you can also see those in the frame grapher. So if you need or want to know about that, you should come to office hours where I have a good internet connection. Okay. You can also see that the transfer frame is connected in sequences with pre-transfer and post-transfer. These frames are then further connected in ways that I cut off from this diagram to possession. So before the transfer, one person has something. After the transfer, the other person has something. Then you can see that there's, even above commercial transaction, there's something even wider, which is a commerce scenario. And the commerce scenario has commercial transaction just as a little piece. So I'm actually going to interrupt very slightly and see if I can get some people to imagine what the other pieces would be, just to sort of see how you're understanding what we've got going on. Okay, so we have two pieces, two subframes that are indicated here. We have having commercial agreement, and we have a commercial transaction. Okay, those are two things that happen in commerce. And now I'm going to ask somebody to raise their hand and say, what's something else that happens in commerce? that we don't have in FrameNet yet. Okay, I'm going to point to you. Yep.
We could probably have a frame for goods.
Yes, absolutely. That's part of the scene, and should be described at the high level. I agree completely. So, what about events? Are there other events that happen in the course of commerce? So, okay, we have a commercial agreement, we make a transfer, but some other stuff has to happen.
Maybe advertising.
Advertising is an excellent answer because, in fact, probably advertising impacts our lives more than actually buying stuff because we're always seeing advertising. What else might happen?
You could have tax collection.
The collection of sales tax is absolutely a part of the scene. It would get very specific. You can start to see why maybe we haven't filled in everything here. I'll just give you...
Imagine how hard it will be to do it cross-linguistically.
Yes. Miriam?
I actually can't see whether it's on the slide, but we need to transfer money.
So there is, in the money transfer, there is a frame for that underneath the commercial transaction part.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, so that part's there.
Okay, I just didn't see that. Great.
I will point out, just to give you a couple more examples of things that aren't here. For one thing, in the money transfer part, most of the time, it's not actually just a single transfer, one direction. Most of the time, if you're giving them cash, they have to give you change. So there's a third transfer. It's optional, but it's often there. There's also differences between paying with cash or paying with credit or paying on layaway. There's many, many, many different elaborations to this scene, even underneath the money transfer part. Also going back up to the commerce scenario to think about other things that happen there, you have to have, in most cases where you make a serious purchase, you have to have a process of negotiation. Somebody names one price, then the other person names a different price. It goes back and forth. In English, we call this haggling. The word haggle is exactly about this. So,
there's also another kind of commerce, if you will, that which we call barter. So instead of exchanging money for goods, you exchange either services, or you exchange goods, or you exchange goods for services.
Yep. All right. So there, of course, believe it or not, is more to say about the scene. We could get arbitrarily elaborate about it because commerce permeates our lives. So of course we talk about it. Here we talk about something else that permeates our lives, crime. So I'm not going to talk that much about the direct frame of committing crime because we all know what that is. And you can see that there are many kinds. I mean, theft, murder, other exciting things. And all of them involve an interaction between a legality frame, a compliance frame, and a general idea of doing something bad. So it's useful to have a committing crime frame to put all of that information together so that you can then inherit it for all the other crime frames. But it's also the case, because we live in a complex society, that that's not where the story of crime ends. Most of the time, if a serious crime is committed, then there's other stuff that happens in sequence, right? It cannot start until the crime is committed unless you're in a very bad dictatorship kind of situation. Then after the crime is committed, or at least someone thinks there's a crime committed, you have a criminal investigation, and there are pieces of that, like suspicion of a crime. Somebody can be a suspect. Then you have the core part of the criminal process where there's some person who was a suspect and now they're actually being charged. And in that thing that we call the criminal process, which is a subframe of this crime scenario after the investigation, after the crime, generally, then you have all of these other things that happen in terms of being arrested. And in the American system, you have an arraignment. You might have a trial. Generally, you do. In the American system, you can have plea bargaining, which can short-circuit this and go out of the trial phase. Even within the trial, there's an elaborate hierarchy of arguments, counter-arguments, subpoenas, everything. There's a whole world there. And then you end up with sentencing. You might have the possibility of appeal. You see that this is a very, very rich set of frames, and is really quite useful for doing inferencing, as has actually been shown in some publications. Here's something that I don't think has ever been talked about in any publication, which is the set of frames related to people being required to do things, or events that have to happen for some reason. So we actually have a pretty good chunk of a hierarchy about that. And it's really important because we're all the time talking about what we should do, what we have to do, what you shouldn't do, all of that. And so we have the most basic frame up at the top, which is not, in some sense, the core. The most basic frame is a requirement scenario. And in this frame, you have two events where for the second event to happen, the first event has to happen. So to have rain, you need clouds, right? So clouds are necessary for rain, would be in the being necessary frame, which is a perspective on this requirement scenario. Then you have another perspective. So rain requires clouds. Then you have a frame that uses being necessary, which is called required event. And in this case, it's not just that there's one event that brings about another or that is required for the other. This is already bringing in ideas of good and bad. So, for example, the desirable event frame, which is connected to that by using relation, that means that if you do this, it will be good. So if I say, you should turn in your homework on time, what I mean is my opinion of your turning in homework is that that's a good thing, right? In the required event perspective on this thing, and sorry, it's not actually a perspective relation, this is work in progress. The required event perspective on this is actually, if you don't do this, it will be bad. So if I say you must turn in your homework, the basic difference between must and should is emphasizing the good or emphasizing the bad. And of course, we have a lot which is underneath the obligation scenario, which inherits from required event. Because mostly we focus on the bad. It's part of human nature. I'm going to skip past this because we're about to be done. But this is the set of frames that connect together adjectives with other kinds of ways of considering measurable attributes. Okay, so for tomorrow, We're going to talk about full text annotation. And I find that stuff super fun, especially because it uses everything that you have learned. There's nothing that you've learned that won't be useful for that. So it's quite demanding, but it actually means that all the stuff you learned has a real use. As far as the reading goes, you should continue the selection from chapter 6. So if you haven't finished it, don't worry, it's still assigned. Part of the reason why you really need to read it is because I actually would like you to think about a couple of things. So first of all, what semantic info isn't in FrameNet yet? So when you read through that section of chapter 6, that will tell you all of the kinds of semantic information that we have. What kinds of semantic information do we not have? And then, once you've thought about that, there are definitely answers. I promise. There are definitely things that we don't have in FrameNet. I've even mentioned some of them. How would you add it? So should it be a relation? Should it be a semantic type? Should it be a meta type? Which way would you put it in there if you wanted to put it in there? Or, and I'll leave this open, I mean, I can't think of a reason why you'd want something other than those. But if you come up with an idea which doesn't match any of those, but is a different idea about how you would put this information in, that's fine too. So if you could write up a little something about that, that would be awesome. Just a paragraph or something. Okay? Obrigado.